Whispers in the Archives, Eleanor Reed clutched her leather messenger bag as she approached Thornfield Manor. The imposing Victorian mansion loomed against the gray London sky, its windows like watchful eyes. At 24 with a master's degree in historical preservation and not much else to her name, this job opportunity felt almost mystical personal archivist to Harrison Blake. The notoriously private tech magnate whose fortune rivaled small nations. The gravel crunched beneath her sensible shoes as she approached the entrance. Eleanor tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, straightened her simple navy dress, and reminded herself that competence mattered more than confidence. The door swung open before she could knock. Double quotes, Ms. Reed, I presume. The woman who greeted her had a steel-gray bobbin eyes that missed nothing. I'm Mrs. Porter, Mr. Blake's house manager. You're precisely on time. Follow me. Eleanor was led through halls adorned with artwork worth more than her student loans. The manor smelled of beeswax polish and old books, a comforting scent that calmed her nerves. Wait here, Mrs. Porter instructed, gesturing to a chair outside a heavy oak door. Minutes later, the door opened. Harrison Blake stood framed in the doorway, tall and imposing at 39. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes, startlingly blue, assessed her with clinical precision. Eleanor Reed, he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice. Come in. His office was unexpectedly warm, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace crackling softly. A massive desk dominated the space, covered with neatly arranged documents. Your credentials are impressive, he said without preamble. Cambridge. Specialization in Victorian. Literary archives, published paper on preserving family histories. But credentials aren't why I hired you. Eleanor found her voice. May I ask why you did then? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Your thesis. You wrote that family archives aren't just papers, but the whispered conversations of generations. I need someone who understands that distinction. He moved to a side door, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. This is where you'll work. My grandfather's collection, letters, manuscripts, journals, spanning 5 generations of Blakes. The family legacy has been neglected. I want it properly cataloged and preserved. The room beyond was a researcher's dream, a private library, filled with boxes, folios, and leather-bound journals. Why now? Lenore asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Harrison's expression hardened momentarily. Recent events have reminded me of the importance of truth. My grandfather left specific instructions that these archives should be organized 50 years after his death. That anniversary is approaching, I understand. Eleanor stepped into the room, already mentally cataloging the work ahead. No, Ms. Reed, I don't think you do. His voice had dropped. These papers contain family secrets, some may be uncomfortable. Your contract includes extensive confidentiality clauses for good reason. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I respect. History, Mr. Blake? Even its darker chapters. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or approval. You'll have complete access to this wing of the house. Mrs. Porter will show you to your quarters. You begin tomorrow. As Eleanor followed Mrs. Porter through the labyrinthine hallways, she felt Harrison's eyes on her back. She heard whispers from the staff as they passed something about being brave or foolish to take this position after what happened to the last one. That night, in her elegant but austere room, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, wondering what secrets lay buried in the Blake family archives, and why Harrison Blake, a man who controlled technology empires, seemed so haunted by the ghosts of his past. Tomorrow, she would begin unraveling the whispers of a dynasty. She had no idea that she would soon become part of its most unexpected chapter. Shadows of the past 3 weeks into her position at Thornfield Manor, Eleanor found herself falling into a rhythm. Each morning she woke at dawn, took breakfast in her room, and was in the archives by 7. Harrison Blake rarely disturbed her work, though she occasionally felt his presence lingering at the doorway. Watching her methodical sorting of his family's history, today, she was deep in a collection of letters from the 1960s when she discovered something odd: correspondence Between Harrison's grandfather, Edmund Blake, and someone named Josephine Winters. The letters were intimate, passionate even, though Edmund had been married to Harrison's grandmother at the time. Finding anything interesting? Harrison's voice startled her. Eleanor jumped, nearly knocking over her tea. Mr. Blake, I didn't. Here you come in. He approached her table, eyes falling to the letters she'd been reading. Something darkened in his expression. Ah, you found Josephine. These letters suggest she and your grandfather were having an affair. Yes. Harrison picked up one of the letters, his fingers tracing the handwriting. Family legend says she was the love of his life, but he chose duty over passion. My grandmother knew, of course. In those circles, everyone knew everything but said nothing. Eleanor watched him carefully. Is that why you wanted these archives organized? To understand your family's secrets? Harrison placed the letter down with deliberate care. Perhaps I wanted to understand why the men in my family make the choices they do. He glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. Join me for dinner tonight, Ms. Reed. 6 months of eating alone in your room seems excessive, even for someone as dedicated as you. That evening, Eleanor found herself seated across from Harrison in the Manor's formal dining room. She'd changed into the nicest dress. She'd brought a simple emerald silk that made her eyes appear more green than hazel. Tell me about yourself, Harrison said after their first course. Something not in your meticulously detailed CV? Eleanor took a sip of wine. I grew up in foster care. Books and historical documents became my escape of other people's stories. When mine felt incomplete, Harrison's expression softened. Oh, that explains your careful handling of these family histories. What about you? Eleanor ventured. The tabloids paint quite a picture of Harrison Blake, the tech titan with the tragic past. His jaw tightened. Vultures, the lot of them. After Victoria died, my wife, they invented stories. Said I drove her to it, that my coldness pushed her over the edge. He stared into his wine glass. 8 years, and they still print anniversary pieces speculating on whether I'm to blame. I'm sorry. Eleanor's voice was gentle. Lost like that ... It changes. A person. It wasn't just Victoria's death. Harrison's voice had dropped to a near whisper. It was the betrayal. My closest friend and business partner, Julian Westfield, had been embezzling for years. Victoria discovered it. The night before she died, they argued. I've often wondered. If he said something, did something. Eleanor reached across the table, an instinctive gesture of comfort, but stopped short of touching his hand. The archives won't change what happened. No, Harrison agreed, but perhaps they'll help me understand my legacy. The Blake men have a patterned success in business, failure in matters of the heart. As weeks turned to months, their dinners became a regular occurrence. Eleanor learned that beneath his controlled exterior, Harrison was thoughtful, even funny. In a dry, sardonic way. He discovered her passion for obscure Victorian poetry and left rare volumes on her desk. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, neither acknowledging the growing tension between them. Then came the night she found Edmund Blake's confession. Hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer was a handwritten admission that he had sabotaged Josephine's career and marriage after she finally left him, ensuring she would suffer for choosing freedom over him. The pattern of control and punishment was disturbingly familiar. Eleanor had read similar accusations about Harrison in old news articles. When she confronted Harrison with the document, his face went white. I'm becoming him, he whispered. More. To himself than to her. All this time I thought I was different. Eleanor stood before him holding the damning pages. You are different. You're trying to understand the past, not repeat it. Thunder rumbled outside as their eyes locked. The air between them charged with something neither had dared name. Storm of truth. The storm had been building all day, much like the tension between Eleanor and Harrison. Rain lashed against the windows of the library where they had retreated after dinner. The confession of Edmund Blake lying between them on the antique coffee table. My entire life, Harrison said, staring into the fire. I've been running from my family's legacy while simultaneously building upon it. The Blake Empire was founded on my grandfather's ruthlessness, his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Eleanor sat across from him, her fingers nervously tracing the spine of a leather-bound book. But you've built something different. Your technological innovations have helped millions. Have I? Harrison stood abruptly, moving to the window. Lightning illuminated his profile, casting stark shadows across his face. 2 years ago, I systematically destroyed Archer Communications when they tried to compete with Blake Tech. Ruined Julian professionally after Victoria's death, made sure he'd never work in the industry again. He betrayed you, Eleanor said softly. That's different. Harrison turned to her, his expression tormented. Is it? Or am I justifying the same behavior my grandfather exhibited? Control, punishment, power. A crash of thunder shook the manor, and the lights flickered before going out entirely. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the dancing firelight. I should find candles, Eleanor murmured, rising from her seat. Eleanor Harrison's voice stopped her. He rarely used her first name, and it sounded intimate in the darkness. I've watched you these past months. The care you take with every document, every fragment of history. You seek to understand, not judge. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. You've seen the worst of my family now. The manipulation, the cruelty, disguised as business acumen. I've also seen kindness, she countered. The letters from your father to your mother. The scholarship foundation your grandmother established. Your own work funding medical research after Victoria's illness. Something broke in Harrison's expression. How do you do that? Find light in all this darkness. Because darkness isn't the absence of light, Eleanor whispered. It's just what we see when we close our eyes to possibilities. The space between them vanished as Harrison cupped her face in his hands. I've been closed to possibilities for a very long time. Their first kiss was hesitant, a question asked and answered in the silence between thunderclaps. The second was not. Years of isolation and longing seemed to pour out of Harrison as he pulled Eleanor against him, his fingers tangling in her hair. I should stop, he murmured against her lips. You work for me. This is what we both want, Eleanor finished, surprising herself with her boldness. At 24, her romantic experiences had been limited to brief college relationships that never deepened beyond superficial connection. Harrison drew back slightly, studying her face in the firelight. Eleanor, I haven't. Since Victoria, there's been no one.
Ow.
She placed her hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat.
On me.
Not like this. The confession hung between them, vulnerable and raw. When Harrison kissed her again, it was with reverent tenderness. He led her upstairs to his rooms, a suite she had never entered during her months at Thornfield. Unlike the rest of the manors, Victorian opulence, his personal space was minimalist, modernist sanctuary from the weight of history. Their lovemaking was unhurried, each touch an exploration and discovery. Eleanor's inexperience was met with patient guidance, her vulnerability with equal openness. In the aftermath, as they lay entwined with rain still battering the windows, Harrison traced patterns on her bare shoulder. I never expected you, he confessed into the darkness. I hired an archivist and found. Found what? Eleanor asked when he didn't continue. Harrison's arms tightened around her. Someone who sees me. Not the billionaire, not the tragic widower, not the ruthless businessman. Just me. As dawn broke, painting the room in soft gray light, Harrison sat at his desk while Eleanor slept. He made a series of phone calls, his voice low and determined. He drafted emails, signed digital documents, and made a decision that would shock London's business world to its core. By the time Eleanor woke, Harrison had set in motion a transformation that would change both their lives forever. The boardroom revelation Alana felt distinctly out of place in her simple navy dress and modest pearl earrings, a gift from Harrison that morning. The Blake Tech headquarters in central London was a temple of glass and steel, and the executive boardroom on the 50th floor offered panoramic views of the city below. 12 people sat around the massive table, all wearing expressions, ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Harrison had been cryptic about why he wanted her to accompany him today. There's something I need to do, was all he'd said as they'd driven into the city. He hadn't mentioned the night they'd shared, though his hand had found hers in the car. fingers intertwining with quiet intimacy. Now he stood at the head of the table, commanding the room with his presence alone. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, thank you for accommodating this emergency meeting." His voice was calm, authoritative. "I've brought Ms. Eleanor Reed with me today because she will be taking on a new role within the Blake organization." Eleanor felt the weight of evaluating stares. A woman with a sleek silver bob and sharp eyes. Vivian Blackwood, Harrison's CFO, according to the briefing he'd given hers, spoke first. "Harrison, while we all appreciate your personal interests," she said with a pointed glance at Eleanor, "this is hardly the venue to introduce your latest companion." The subtle insult made Eleanor stiffen, but Harrison merely smiled a cold, dangerous expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Vivian, your assumption is both incorrect and inappropriate. Ms. Reed has been working at Thornfield for the past 7 months, cataloging the Blake family archives. During that time, she has demonstrated exceptional insight, integrity, and intelligence qualities this board could benefit from." He pressed a button, and the wall screen illuminated with legal documents, effective immediately. "I am appointing Eleanor Reed as interim chairperson of the Blake Family Trust." A stunned silence fell over the room, followed by an explosion of voices. "This is absurd. She's practically a child. Shareholders will revolt." Harrison raised a hand, silencing them. "The Blake Family Trust controls 51% of Blake Tech's voting shares. The trust charter gives me sole discretion over its leadership. My decision is final." Eleanor sat frozen, her mind racing to process what was happening. The Blake Family Trust was the cornerstone of Harrison's empire, the entity that controlled not just Blake Tech, but dozens of other companies, foundations, and properties. Harrison, a distinguished older man, said carefully, "May I remind you that after the unfortunate situation with Julian, we agreed major decisions would be discussed with the board first. This isn't a business decision, Thomas. It's a personal one." Harrison's gaze found Eleanor's across the room. "I've spent years surrounded by people who see me as a means to an end. People who would say anything, do anything, to gain power and wealth. Ms. Reed is different. She sees the truth in people there. Darkness in their light-tanned, still believes in redemption." Eleanor found her voice at last. "Mr. Blake, I have no experience in corporate governance. I'm an archivist, not a business leader." Harrison's expression softened. "You understand legacy better than anyone in this room? The Blake Empire isn't just about quarterly profits or stock valuations. It's about the impact we leave on the world." A younger board member leaned forward. "With all due respect, Mr. Blake, we don't know anything about Ms. Reed. How can we trust her with this responsibility?" "Because I trust her," Harrison said simply. "And because, unlike some in this room, she has no hidden agenda." The accusation hung in the air. Eleanor watched as several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "There's something else you should know," Harrison continued. "Night, I received concerning information about irregular financial transactions within Blake Tech's European division. An independent audit will begin tomorrow. Ms. Reed will oversee the process." The room erupted again, but this time Eleanor detected fear beneath the outrage. Harrison had laid a trap, and someone had walked right into it, as the meeting concluded. Harrison pulled Eleanor into a private office adjacent to the boardroom. "I should have warned you," he said, closing the door behind them. "But I needed their genuine reactions." "You've just handed me control of billions in assets," Eleanor said, her voice shaking slightly. "Why? What if I'm not who you think I am?" Harrison took her hands in his. "Last night, after you fell asleep, I realized something. The Blake men have always chosen power over love, control over trust. I don't want to be another link in that chain. So this is, what, a test of your ability to trust someone?" "No," Harrison said firmly. "It's recognition of who you are, someone incorruptible, someone who values truth above power." He paused, vulnerability flickering across his features. "And yes, it's also a leap of faith. Perhaps the first real one I've taken since Victoria died." Eleanor searched his face. "What if I fail? What if I can't handle this responsibility?" Harrison's smile was genuine now. "Then we fail together. But Eleanor, I've watched you piece together my family's complicated history with compassion and clarity. The company needs those qualities now more than ever." As they returned to the boardroom, Eleanor felt the weight of suspicious gazes. She had gone from invisible archivist to one of the most powerful women in London business overnight. Knew nothing about corporate governance, financial statements, or managing a multi-billion-pound empire. But she did understand people. And as she took her seat at Harrison's right hand, she began to observe the board members with the same careful attention she'd given the Blake family archives, who looked frightened rather than just surprised. Who was already calculating how to use this situation to their advantage? By the end of the day, Eleanor had identified 3 board members whose reactions suggested involvement in whatever financial irregularities Harrison had discovered, and she had made her first executive decision. Rather than staying at the company penthouse, Harrison offered she would return to Thornfield Manor with him. There were still archives to organize, still truths to uncover, and now a legacy to protect. Legacy rewritten 6 months after the boardroom revelation. Eleanor stood at the windows of what was now her office at Blake Tech headquarters. Spring had transformed London, cherry blossoms dotting the parks visible from her 50th floor vantage point. Behind her, stacks of reports awaited her attention: quarterly financials, philanthropy initiatives, sustainability projects. The transition had not been smooth. 3 board members had resigned following the audit that uncovered their complicity in a scheme to inflate European division profits. The business press had been merciless, dubbing Eleanor the Archivist Empress and speculating endlessly about her relationship with Harrison. Shareholders had initially panicked, sending Blake Tech stock plummeting before Harrison's steady leadership and Eleanor's surprising aptitude for corporate governance stabilized the situation. "Ms. Reed," her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Blake is here to see you." Harrison entered without waiting for a response, a habit that still made Eleanor smile. Despite her attempts to instill proper office protocol, the board approved the restructuring plan, he announced, closing the door behind him. "Unanimous vote, even Vivian." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Vivian Blackwood voting in my favor. Perhaps the apocalypse is upon us," Harrison laughed. Sounds still rare enough to delight her. "She respects you now. They all do." He moved to stand beside her at the window. "The Blake Family Trust quarterly review is tomorrow. Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be to justify my leadership." To a room full of lawyers and financial advisors who still think I somehow enchanted you into this position, Harrison's hand found the small of her back. "Okay, they've seen the results. Blake's stock is up 20% since you took over the trust. The new ethical AI division you championed is already attracting top talent. The Thornfield Foundation has doubled its educational grants." Eleanor turned to face him. "None of that would have happened without your support." "It's not true." His blue eyes were intense. "The vision has been yours, Eleanor. I was maintaining an empire. You're transforming it." She shook her head, still uncomfortable with praise. "I simply applied the same principles I used with the archives, preserving what works, contextualizing the past, and making space for future chapters to be written." Harrison took her hands in his expression growing serious. "Speaking of future chapters, there's something I need to show you." An hour later, they were back at Thornfield Manor in the archives room where they'd first met. Harrison unlocked a drawer in the antique desk Eleanor had used during her months of research. "I had this drawn up the morning after the storm," he said, handing her a legal document. "Before the board meeting, before the audit, before I knew if what was between us would last." Eleanor scanned the document, her academic training allowing her to quickly grasp its significance. It was Harrison's will, dated the morning after they'd first spent the night together. He had left everything Blake Tech, the Blake Family Trust, Thornfield Manor, his personal fortune to her. "Harrison ... she whispered, looking up at him in shock. "I've updated it since," he said quickly. "Made provisions for the foundation, for the employees, but the core remains the same." He took a deep breath. "My grandfather chose power over love. My father chose business over family. I watched Julian choose greed over loyalty. I've spent my life becoming what I thought a Blake should be: successful, controlling, isolated." He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Then you arrived with your quiet courage and your belief that even the darkest history contains light. You changed everything, Eleanor. You didn't have to give me your empire to prove that, she said softly. I didn't give you my empire. Harrison corrected her. I gave you my trust. There's a difference. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Now I'm asking if you'll let me give you my name as well. The ring inside was not what she expected. Not a massive diamond befitting a billionaire's bride, but a delicate vintage piece featuring a sapphire surrounded by tiny pearls. It was my grandmother's, Harrison explained. The woman who knew about Josephine but chose to stay, to believe my grandfather could be better than his worst impulses. Eleanor touched the ring gently. Are you sure? After everything you've learned about your family's history? I'm sure because of what I've learned, Harrison said firmly. The archives taught me that patterns can be broken, that legacies can be rewritten. He smiled up at her. Besides, every great family needs a good archivist to remember the truth of where they came from. Eleanor slid from her chair to kneel with him on the floor of the archives where their story had begun. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes to all of it. 1 year later, Eleanor Blake stood in the newly renovated East Wing of Thornfield Manor. The former archives had been transformed into a museum and research center, open to scholars studying the impact of the Blake family on British business and society. The project had been Eleanor's vision bringing the family's complicated history into the light rather than keeping it locked away. Harrison joined her, slipping an arm around her expanding waistline. At 6 months pregnant, Eleanor had finally relinquished some of her trust responsibilities, though she still chaired the board meetings via video conference. What do you think? He asked, gesturing to the exhibition space. Will future generations understand what we were trying to do here? Eleanor leaned against him, contemplating the displays chronicling both the achievements and the failures of the Blake dynasty. I hope they'll see that we tried to learn from the past rather than bury it, that we believed redemption was possible. Harrison's hand caressed her stomach, feeling their daughter kick. The next generation of Blakes won't have to discover their history through hidden letters and secret confessions. No, Eleanor agreed, covering his hand with hers. They'll know from the beginning that legacy isn't what you inherit, but what you choose to build. Outside, spring rain began to fall on Thornfield Manor, not the violent storm that had brought them together, but a gentle shower promising new growth. But inside, surrounded by the whispers of the past and the promise of the future, Harrison and Eleanor Blake continued writing their chapter in a story generations in the making.